sometimes as parents, that's our experience might just be the days are overwhelming for us. And instead of existing at a 7 out of 10 all day at this like brink of a panic attack, can we bring ourselves down to a 5? And if so, can we see that as successful, or can we see that as motivating to continue to make some more changes? And
Welcome to Sensitive Stories. This episode is for educational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for treatment with a mental health or medical professional. Let's dive in. Amy, can you start off by telling us your HSP discovery story, how and when you realized that you're highly sensitive?
yes, so I think there's a few different parts to this story. When I was a kid, I definitely had that experience of being told, you kind of understand what's going on, and being the person that people would come to for advice. So I had the sense of I was empathic as a kid, which I know is not quite the same thing, but it's a kind of a building block. So that's where my awareness of, okay, I'm a little different, or this is a unique aspect of who I am, started. And I don't think I learned about the word HSP or being highly sensitive until I was probably in my early 20s or so. And it did resonate at that time, but I wasn't super focused on what that meant in my everyday life. It was just like, okay, that's interesting. All right, that connects. But it really wasn't until I had kids, my first child, but especially after I had my second child, that I really came to understand how my sensitivity was a part of my daily experience. It just sort of amplified it, which I see with other parents too. Pregnancy and postpartum can certainly amplify the sensitivity and the other traits of being an HSP that we experience. And so that's my origin story. I think a lot of it honestly came from realizing, initially was realizing, oh my gosh, I'm so overstimulated, I'm overtouched, this is too much for me. So it was sort of the negative aspects or the challenges that brought HSP to the forefront. And then as I unpacked it a little bit more, for me personally, I was able to also see the gifts of sensitivity and attunement, in my personal life, but also as a parent. And so it really actually dovetailed quite a bit with my clinical work, as a therapist as well. So I was learning from my life and from my clients, and we were just all learning from each other. So that's how I kind of figured it out, and I feel like I'm still figuring it out. We're all just learning. So
Right, it's such an ongoing process. And I hear from so many folks that parenting was the piece that clicked it into place, whether being more sensitive during pregnancy or during those first few years and that big adjustment in life, or they have highly sensitive kids and they realize
hmm
it through that.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, it's this process of, I think, first tackling the hard parts of the trait
Mm.
and then eventually getting to the more positive experiences because the more difficult parts are the ones that stick out to us the most.
Definitely, definitely. Those are the things that people come to therapy or come to coaching
Yes.
or come to other supports for, saying this doesn't feel good. I can't handle this, or this is really difficult for me, or I feel different from other parents. Why can't I
Yeah.
do it that way? I feel like I'm falling short. I feel guilty.
Yeah.
And I certainly experienced some of that as well, and still do, at times. But yeah, it can kind of bring it to the forefront for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, there is a lot of comparison that happens, I would imagine. Could you share more about your personal experiences if you're comfortable about being a highly sensitive parent?
Sure. Yeah. So I alluded to earlier that it was particularly apparent after my second child was born. And I think I do share freely about this on my blog. So I have no trouble sharing it. But what really brought my sensitivity into focus was, I had a really bad panic attack. I think when my second kid, my baby, was like 3 weeks old, 4 weeks old, and I was nauseous, and I was black, my vision was blacking out, and I was scared because I couldn't take care of him. I remember I
Sure.
set him down on my bed, and it was pretty
It's
scary.
scary.
It was
Yeah.
very scary. So I thankfully got all sorts of support for that, and was able to heal over time from that, and make lots of adjustments. which is something that some knowledge that I pass on to the people that I work with. But um, and I was a therapist at this point too, but to
Mm-hmm.
to make all these connections when you're the person experiencing it isn't always easy. So after a lot of, reflection and observations from other people in my life, I realized this is, for me, it was primarily about overstimulation. So
Mm-hmm.
the pretty bad panic attacks that I had following the birth of my second child often were times when I was parenting solo, when I was like alone in the house. Um, Responsible for both kids, and there's like a little over 3 year span between them. So my 3 year old at the time, he's now 10, but my 3 year old would be like crawling over me, mommy, look at this, mommy,
Yeah.
I want to see the baby, and just like trying touching me and all over me,
Mm-hmm.
which, you know, for HSPs, we often don't love that type of
Yes.
touch. We might enjoy cuddles at times. But the kind of like crawling or tapping sensations were really hard for me. And so I specifically remember this one moment where I had my, 1 month old baby breastfeeding. So that's also a sensation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And has emotional baggage for a lot of people. And um, my 3 year old was just like climbing on my back. And I just can't even describe this sensory overload that happened in that moment.
Yeah.
And it led to several, just kind of a series of panic attacks that were actually a bit confusing to me at the time because it wasn't fitting neatly in the category of postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. And I didn't have training in that. I had a little bit, but not a lot at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, what is this? Like, I know I'm having panic attacks, but why are they happening? I didn't have the hallmarks of traditional anxiety or depression. It really was about overstimulation. And so that's to me where a lot of the sort of self-education and learning from other people's stories, and where my work with HSP parents was originally born in that very
Yes.
challenging, not just moment, but like period of life for me, of that early infancy, but also having an older, like a toddler preschool age, which is that double whammy tends to be particularly difficult for HSP parents, as I've
Mm-hmm.
noticed over time. Yeah.
Right. I'm not a parent myself, but I've seen that with clients. There's something,
Hmm.
well, not something. I think it makes sense when you lay it out. Adding that second child creates a whole nother level of intensity around parenting. And I just think
Yes.
about you having children on both sides of you when your body has just been through so much, giving
Hmm.
birth again, and already overstimulated, already exhausted, I'm sure, underslept, and then just having that be a kind of a breaking point.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then everything
absolutely.
changes.
Hmm.
Um, and you said you started to make some adjustments after that. Can you speak to what that looked like for you in those
Yeah, yeah.
circumstances?
And this is the same thing that I try to support people in, but going to therapy. So trying to
Yeah.
like, have someone supportive. Let's see. Medication if or getting
Hmm.
evaluated for that if that's helpful. So talking to a doctor about what that might look like. And then obviously there's a lot of lifestyle changes. So
Hmm.
things like adding more support in. That is difficult. I know we're planning on talking about that more and later
Yeah.
in the show, uh, but but that's a big factor, and
Yeah.
a lot of us are under resourced in terms of
Hmm.
support and the downtime or the alone time that we get. So learning to build that in, and definitely also just some somatic regulation. So decreasing the intensity of the of inputs, the sensory inputs, and there's lots of different ways um, that I did that. I think I learned to, on a personal level, I learned to kind of to tap out at the end of the day. Like I remember, I was working at the time, but there were some days that I was at home with the kids instead of at an office. And so my husband would come back and I would kind of look at him like, and eventually I didn't even have to do that anymore. It was just understood, or we had a conversation that I was going to, when he came home, that I would have some time where I
Right.
could go up and lay down. And often that was, depending on the day, I would just like inhale some essential oils. I would maybe cry a little bit. I might hop in the bath or the shower. So just lots and lots of sensory regulation.
Hmm.
And if we can do that on our own and in a really take a break, that's great. But I also hear a lot from parents like, I don't have that time, but how do I manage in the moment? And so taking like those like mini breaks, like hopping in the bathroom for a few minutes and having something in there that's going to be helpful. So just finding little
Mm-hmm.
pockets of time, but also making some systemic changes, I guess, to like how much load was on me and how much
Mm-hmm.
support I had. And that tends to be so important. Not easy, but very important for a lot of parents to do if they're finding themselves in this situation.
Right, you absolutely need help. And I've heard Dr. Aaron talk about that. She's like, at the very least, you have to find somewhere to get help, whatever
Hmm.
that looks like. So
Hmm.
making some big changes, and then also the little micro changes, like have some essential oils tucked away in the bathroom, or
Yes.
maybe some other. What other things could you tuck away in the bathroom for yourself?
Yeah. Well, I one of the things I talk about with clients is building I call it a coping skills kit, and
Mm.
it can look a couple of different ways. It can be like in a cute little basket or a little like a pouch like this that you can just
Oh,
like
great.
toss in your purse or your backpack or your diaper bag.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and basically I use it as like a five senses sort of thing. So like mint or gum or candy or just something to kind of focus your attention back on your own body. I think, a lot of the time, I get at least my experience as an HSP is when I'm overstimulated, I'm both hyper attuned to what I'm feeling, but also sort of disconnected from my body in a very unpleasant way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are pleasant sensory grounding tools. So it could be an essential oil or a chocolate or a ginger candy, or it could be like a photo of a loved one or a really peaceful place. It could be a reminder to listen to just a little handwritten note of affirmation, or a reminder to listen to a certain song. So I like this tangible coping skills kit, or even like a coping skills menu is another thing that I work
Mm.
on with people a lot of. When we're in that place of overstimulation, we're not usually capable of saying, gosh, you know what sounds good right now? I really should do this for myself. Often we're frozen, or
Right.
we're in fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode, and we're not necessarily the best at knowing how to take care of
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. So if we have a list, or we have a tangible little baggie that has a few things just to turn down the volume a little bit. Oh, earplugs is another thing you can
Oh,
pop in
yes.
there. Or dark sunglasses, or something cozy, little fidget toys. Um, it's not going to solve everything, but as I say, it'll take you down. If you're like at an 8 out of 10 overstimulation, doing that might take you to a 6, and it might get you to a
Right.
place where you can communicate to a partner, hey, I need to take a break, or um, pop your kids on an audiobook or a TV show, and you lay down in your room for a little bit. So doing
Yeah.
what you need to do at that point. Yeah,
Right. Utilizing whatever's available, whether that's another
exactly.
person to help you buy you a few minutes, having tangible tactile objects that can
Mhm.
support your nervous system. But yeah, just taking the edge off so you don't slip
Mhm.
into that panic attack where your nervous system doesn't feel completely overwhelmed.
That's right.
And I imagine you need to do that throughout the day.
Yes. Yeah. So one thing I hear from parents is like, oh, it doesn't work, or like it doesn't help. I still feel that way. And this is maybe not easy to hear, but sometimes it's not about getting back all the way down to 0, or like
Yeah.
3 out of 10 calmness. Like we sometimes as parents, that's our experience might just be the days are overwhelming for us, and instead of existing at a 7 out of 10 all day at this like brink of a panic attack, can we bring ourselves down to a 5? And if so, can we see that as successful, or can we see that as motivating to continue to make some more changes,
Mhm.
and to really see it as a practice. So you mentioned like you're seeing like little changes, but also systemic. And I talk also about these like micro. I'm a social worker by trade, so micro,
Mhm.
meso, and macro, like
Uh-huh.
these different levels of, I guess, like self-intervention. And
Mm.
so, what would it look like to have those like micro breaks during the day? What does it look like to have those meso breaks? It could be daily, or it could be a couple times a week, where you know that you have some downtime, or you have childcare covered, and you plan to really care for yourself well during that time and attend to your nervous system and
Mm-hmm.
tend to who you are outside of parenthood, which is another whole can of worms that that can certainly come up for HSPs too, because we are dedicated people, we are intentional, we are thoughtful,
Yeah.
we're values driven, and um, so sometimes we can get lost in the weeds of parenting and parenthood and kind of forget about our own selves.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you want to give everything to your children, especially sensitive people when we care so deeply and we're thinking about the big picture all the time. That can get really overwhelming. So think, well, I can't stop. I need to do this or that. Um, so how can we accept that it's okay to take breaks? Because you talked about the comparison piece, looking at, well, this other parent is doing XYZ, or the other parents at my kid's school are showing up to every meeting or activity, or going to all the classes. How can we manage the guilt to do that? I know it's a big question.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, oh my gosh, that comes up all the time, honestly. And one of my favorite ways to address that is just sort of like a curiosity and an openness to what would it like to make some changes? What would happen if we made these changes? And if you let's say no to something or decide, I'm not going to volunteer at my kid's super overstimulating field trip for
Right.
this week, for example, and instead I'm going to use that afternoon off of work to get a massage or to lay down and read or go on a walk. How does that change how I feel during the day, during that time? How does it change how I feel at the end of the day when I'm engaging with um, kids or other loved ones? And I mean, basically all whenever people make decisions to pull back from things that overstimulate them, doesn't mean we need to get rid of them completely, because sometimes we make that choice to kind of sacrifice a little bit to do something that is values rooted for ourselves. But just to observe, does this make a difference? And on the flip side, being able to look at days, honestly, but self-compassionately, to look at days where we really kind of overbooked ourselves or we
Right.
overdid it, even if it's things that are important to us. Oh, like I want to, get on the floor and play Lego with my kids, and then I want to take them to the zoo, and then I want to do this and that. Most HSP parents cannot, we don't tolerate that level of intense
Yeah.
activity very well. And so on the outside, it might look like, gosh, I had a great day as a parent, like check, check, check. I did all
Hmm.
the things, but that's not sustainable for most of us. And sustainability is the name of the game. Parenthood, I like to say
Yes.
parenthood's relentless. It doesn't stop. For most of us, it just kind of keeps going. A lot of us are 24/7 parents, not everyone. There's different family structures and all that, but it's it's important that we make our parenthood and the way that we parent sustainable for us. And
Hmm.
so reframing that as, are you actually, asking people or asking yourself, are you a better, quote, better, I'm putting the big air quotes here, but are you a, quote, better parent according to your own values and goals when you take that downtime or when you don't say yes to everything you possibly could? And often the answer is yes. So,
Hmm. Yeah, it's like a quality over quantity mindset.
yes.
Like, can we show up less, but when we are showing up in the certain activities or going, playing Legos, going to the zoo, um, are we more present? We have
Hmm.
more to offer our kids, more space for connection versus just kind of getting through it.
Yeah, yeah. I completely agree with that. And every parent's different, but I've
Hmm.
found I would say there's a pattern that when I meet with parents who are really overstimulated, often either they're they have a very, very demanding job outside the house, and then they're trying to balance that, or they are at home with their kids almost all the time and have not enough support. And so there's this sort of like lack of balance of taking care of their own needs that almost always shows up in one way or another. And another approach to that guilt, another thing to think about is sort of the history of parenting and parenthood. And I like to tell people, I don't know where this came from, so don't quote me on it, but that parenting, like that word didn't even exist until the 1970s. It wasn't,
Really?
yeah, isn't that fascinating?
That's amazing.
It's like this huge zeitgeist today of this
Wow.
like people are writing about it
Right.
and making whole, I mean, made a whole business about it, right? Like people
Right.
are seeking out information and dialing
Yeah.
into like what does it mean to be parenting, and I want to be that's um but historically not only was there a lot less, for better or for worse, a lot less research and a lot less pressure on parenting in a specific certain way.
Mhm.
There's pluses and minuses to that certainly, but also if we look through like all of human history, we were living in very different circumstances where we had communities and we had other people who were collectively child rearing for the most part. I know there's exceptions to this, but where we weren't as parents responsible for our children 24/7, and we weren't responsible for all of the things, feeding, educating, playing, laundry, or like what attending to all their needs in there's different people to help support with that. It was a
Right.
village or a community. And so um our this is my theory anyway, that our
Mhm.
brains and I think about this for HSPs in general too, that our brains aren't really adapted as humans, but especially as HSPs, to handle the onslaught of all of these demands all the time.
Right.
And I find that to be, I mean, in some ways it's a little sad, but it also to me feels freeing that if that bar is just so high, can I make my own bar about what it means to be like a good parent, or to live the kind of life that I want to live, if I can recognize, gosh, my body and brain aren't really adapted to do this all by
Mhm.
myself. Can I have a little more self-compassion that I really am doing the best that I can, even when I make mistakes?
Absolutely. It's not about being a perfect parent. I think we know that as being therapists that the good enough parent is more than enough.
Yes.
And it's great for kids to see you model imperfection and emotional regulation. They need to see that. So can we take the pressure off? Right? And what you're saying is so valid. We used to have so much more support as eh, parents often had a whole community behind them or family behind them. And a lot of times people are doing it all by themselves. And that's a lot to hold on your shoulders.
It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's where I often start with that like guilt piece is, can we just
Mm-hmm.
reframe this? Can we
Yeah.
take away this expectation of it's exacerbated by social media and frankly a lot of parenting experts too. I'm not going to name names, but
Yeah.
that I tell clients, just take things with a grain of salt, or maybe consider unfollowing some people
Yeah.
if you're feeling just a sense of falling short constantly. You are the expert on your kids. You're the expert on what it means to be a good parent according to you. And so spend some more time listening to that and a little less time absorbing all of the opinions of all of the experts that have opinions about everything. So
Exactly. Like you said, come back to your own values and goals and maybe look at your kids. How are they doing?
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. They don't need all of the bells and whistles necessarily.
No, no.
Yeah. So you're saying, bake in time for yourself, make sure that you're being realistic and looking at what's happening in your own family with your own kids, and
Mhm.
then have that emergency kit for when you need it.
Yes.
Let's say you're a parent who doesn't have a spouse or partner or family member nearby to call and say, "Hey, I need a timeout. I need to tap out."
Mhm.
What can you do then to get through if you don't have that?
Yeah. Okay. I have some ideas here.
Great.
Um, and again, it definitely depends on your situation. As I mentioned, a lot of us are very under-resourced. And so also, side note on that, please don't compare yourself to other people. If you are well-resourced comparatively, I hear that a lot. Well, I do have a supportive partner, or my in-laws are in town and they can help, but it still feels like not enough. We
Hmm.
basically, I've not met an HSP parent who gets enough downtime. Like
Yeah.
just we're all just doing the best we can. So no comparison there. But okay, so some ideas for how we can look for support when it's not necessarily easy to access or baked in. So a couple practical ideas here. One is if there's a gym or a other type of community center in your area. For me locally, it's the YMCA, where there's like a child watch element. I want to say near me that it's like maybe with a childcare element, it's like $100 a month. So it's a bit of a spend, but you can drop you get like 1 to 2 hours of childcare every day. Starting, I want to say it's like 6 weeks old, and you can go exercise and
Oh.
have your child get watched. So it's
Mm-hmm.
quite affordable if you break it down and you're using it all the time. And I know a few people who use that, and they don't even necessarily exercise. They might just like go lay down in the community room or like
Right.
stretch on a yoga mat somewhere. So that's a great thing to try out. There also are, depending on where you are, like libraries or churches or other community centers that offer like childcare nights or mom's morning out or things like that
Mm-hmm.
that are often relatively inexpensive. So it might be worth looking into that. Um, let's see, the other idea that I had too was thinking about ways where in which you can be a parent. So like you might need to have your kid around. Let's say you have like an infant who's breastfeeding every or chest feeding every 30 minutes or an
Mm-hmm.
hour. Like you might have a hard time like being totally physically away from them.
Yeah.
But can you go on a walk? Like I did a lot of baby wearing, but it doesn't, there were times when that did not feel good for my body, especially when I was on edge. So, put the baby in a stroller or in a car seat and let them let them relax, like push them around. You get to move a little bit, and there's a little bit of emotional and physical distancing that can happen, a little bit of nervous system reset that can
Mm-hmm.
happen when you're doing that. And if it feels good to fully walk and run, great. If you're just doing a slow little meander and mindfully taking in the trees and the fresh air and doing some deep breathing, that's great too. So there's some creative ways to still be with your kid, but to find those moments of being less stimulated, but sort of together almost. Yeah.
Yeah, right. You might have more resources available than you think.
Hmm.
And there are creative ways to use what you have to get that break, whether it's a
Yeah.
touch break or just be able to slow yourself down, let your nervous system settle a little bit. Because I think we forget that there are those YMCAs out there, the
Hmm.
churches, the community centers, um, and you don't know that. Oh, they actually offer childcare, which is great. And you can be close enough by if you're feeling maybe a little nervous about that or it's something you haven't done before. And I love that. Even if that's not available, go on a walk.
Yeah.
Get the stroller out.
Hmm.
And then the baby gets to, or the child gets to see the world a little bit, and you get a little bit of a break. Yeah, it's working with what
Yeah.
you have.
And nature is super regulating for everybody. I'll never
Yes.
forget when my niece, who's now like 16, was a few months old. She was just screaming her head off, and I was maybe a teenager at that time, and I held her and I just took her outside and just like put her face right in front of a flower, and she just immediately calmed down and like started reaching out her chubby little hands to grab it,
Oh.
and the tears were forgotten. She was totally
Hmm.
fine. And I actually also am an ecotherapist. I do nature-based therapy
Oh,
too. So I'm a
nice.
big nerd about the research on how nature helps us regulate it and reduces cortisol levels. And so just think of that also as an ally or a caretaker
Yeah.
that for a lot of babies, like you can set them out in the shade in the grass, and they will play with that grass or the sand for hours. Not every kid likes it, but thinking
Yeah.
about things like that might take a little bit of the pressure off of you to be engaged with your kid,
Mhm.
and can you just be in your own body and have them be doing something else for a bit.
Yeah, and how beautiful to let nature regulate you and them.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a win-win. Yeah, when my nephew was little, I would take him out and we would touch leaves or he would just watch birds. And
Yeah. Yeah.
kids tend to love nature.
They do. It's
Yeah,
it's built in and it's free
yeah.
and it really is available, I would say almost anywhere, even if you're
Hmm.
in an apartment somewhere, setting your kid by the window, and having them look out at the clouds passing by or
Yeah.
the the birds going by. So, or even having a plant in your house, things like
Right, that they
that.
can interact with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or like
Mm-hmm.
just thinking like building a sandbox or like a sensory experience when they're a little bit older. Yeah, there's so many
Yes.
options.
Yes,
Yeah, that kids could
absolutely.
get lost in. I love that. Now let's say you're kind of setting these things up for yourself. You're working on creating space for yourself, whether it's kind of parallel play with your child or having them with someone else. If they push back, let's say they don't quite understand, parent needs some alone time or doesn't want to be touched as much.
Yeah.
How do we manage that when there's pushback from the kids? Becomes
Yeah.
really hard.
It is a tough question. I think it obviously it really depends on the age of your kids and where they are developmentally. And there's so many factors with this too. I've worked with parents, HSP parents whose kids also are higher needs or have just other sensory needs where they are constantly kind of touching. And so in that case, sometimes the child might need some support from occupational therapy or
Mm,
um, other types of support. So it's something to think about too, that it might also be not a deficit, but just something to support your child in.
mm, mhm,
I think it depends on the age of the kids, how we communicate with them about our needs. Um, so the question, because you sent me this question in advance, and the question to me is it's so binary. It's like they don't developmentally, they don't understand it.
they
They don't
don't get
understand
it.
it at all.
Yeah.
And I would push back a little bit and say, what do they get? Like what part of it do they
Mm,
understand? Do they understand even a toddler or preschooler might understand privacy or need
mhm,
for privacy or like that's too loud. Let's be more quiet. A baby is kind of a different situation, right? Like
right.
an actual infant, like, yeah, you're not going to be able to communicate that to them. But once they hit, I don't know, 12, 18 months, they are going to, especially 18 months and above, they're going to be able to understand a little bit. They might not like it, but they can
Right.
understand to some extent. So what I see sometimes is parents getting stuck in, they don't understand, but the way that they tried to communicate it to them, let's say when they're 18 months old, and now the child's like 2 or 2.5, and they haven't really tried something new or tried that thing again. And kids change so quickly in terms of their ability to comprehend and their ability to sort of like not just self-regulate, but to kind of entertain themselves, I
Mhm,
guess. And so I always kind of check in and say, like, it's okay if it's still true, but like, how recently have we tried this? And have you tried some new things now that your child is a little older? Have you given them the benefit of the doubt? Just to check in. Um, I do think modeling sometimes can be helpful. So one thing I did when my kids were pretty little, I want to say maybe two or so, is they would they would do this thing that was very annoying to me, which I'm purposely using that word because I hear clients say, "Oh, my kid was so annoying. Oh, I feel bad. I
mhm,
shouldn't say my kid's annoying." And it's like, well, sometimes you feel annoyed by the things that they do. That's okay. That's
right.
just it's the reality. Me too. Um, so anyway, they kept on like mommy, 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 and like
Uh-huh.
tapping me on the shoulder and just or wherever on my body. It could have been anywhere. And yeah, with a 14-month-old, I could have tried, but they wouldn't have understood very well. But at 18 months or 24 months, I could say to them, that doesn't feel good in my body. Can
Mm,
you just place your hand on my arm and say, "Excuse me, mommy," or just say, "Mommy," once, and then I will reply. And then you're kind of reinforcing that, right? So if they do that, "Excuse me, mommy," and just place their hand, okay, thank you for waiting. That was okay. Now what do you need? What do you want to say? And so you're kind of like reinforcing that behavior. It's
mhm,
kind of basic behavioral psychology, but kind of modeling to them. And you can even show them, it doesn't feel good when I tap you a bunch of times, maybe, but does it feel good when I place my hand on your back and say, "Excuse me"? That
mm,
feels nice, doesn't it? So kind of meeting your kids where they are developmentally and
mhm,
trying to communicate and model to them what feels good for you and what doesn't feel good. Um,
mhm,
so that's one aspect, one way to answer the question. Again, it's a huge question. I think I did mention walks as a nice little hack. Another thing that is controversial, so you can take it or leave it, whoever is
mhm.
listening, but is I came up with this once, a screen time minimum. So we
Uh-huh.
also talk about screen time maximums, right? Like, okay, like no more than 30 minutes a day, or no more than an hour a day, or no more than one show.
Right.
And again, this is controversial because I know and I believe the research about screen time and kids and how it impacts
Mhm.
them. I also know that there are plenty of really lovely, peaceful shows. I'm partial to things like Puff and Rock that was on like 10 years ago, uh, that are pretty mellow, somewhat
Yeah.
educational. Octonauts is another good one. And uh, and that ki the kids like, and they, at least my kids don't get too dysregulated after watching it, which is another
Hmm.
factor. But here's the thing is that again, we're aiming for being the best parents we can be, and sometimes that means making sacrifices in one area so that we can improve in another, right? So if
Mm.
I notice, for example, oh my gosh, I'm really touched out, I am about to lose it if I don't take some time to eat something, or to take a shower or whatever. And let's say I have kids who are, 2 and 5, for example. I might say, okay, it's time for every day I expect myself to use, let's say, 30 minutes of a TV show for the kids, and that's my predictable time where I can do what I need, and I can be relatively certain that they're going to be
Hmm.
entertained at least for part of that time. I know sometimes kids don't sit still during those shows too, so if that's you, I hear you. Um, but in lieu of having somebody else actually there to help watch the kids, in lieu of not having the level of support that all of us deserve as parents, you know, consider what would a screen time minimum, one show per day where you have that time, your kids know it's kind of downtime.
Hmm.
You can, if you're opposed to actual screens, you can also think about doing like a audiobook player for kids, some other sort of like downtime, coloring time. My kids would not sit still for something like that, so I just went with screens. But yeah, think about how that might get built in too, because you do need that self-care and alone time. And I would say for most parents, the payoff of you getting that is a lot
Yeah.
more significant than any detriment that your child will have from watching 20 minutes of a TV show. Again, personal opinion, controversial probably, but that's what I think.
Well, I mean, again, it looks you're thinking about the big picture, right? Not the
Yes.
individual moments, but overall, what do I need to put into place to be the best parent I can be?
Yeah.
Right? It's not about the 30 minutes of screen time. It's about, oh, when I get that screen time, I can then be more engaged later.
Hmm.
Instead of, I just think about the parent who's constantly feeling like they're just trying to do everything all the time. And we eventually break down. I mean, you could say that with anything when you're highly
Yes. Yeah,
sensitive, or even when you're not highly sensitive. Everyone has a limit.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, what can I put into place to take care of my needs? And 30 minutes of screen time, which can be kind of mellow. I just think about when I was little, I loved Mr. Rogers and Lassie, and those were very relaxing shows.
Yes. Yeah.
And it allowed me to be occupied while my parents had some time. And it can be a win-win, really.
I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah. So speaking of that overfunctioning, I've heard you talk about that before. And there is that pressure to do all the things, to be the perfect parents. But if we're someone that tends to get stuck in that, letting the guilt lead the way or wanting to compete with non-HSP parents. So if we're finding we're getting stuck in overfunctioning,
Mhm.
what can we do? Can you speak more to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's like a few different steps there. I think one is just recognizing that we are overfunctioning. A lot of the
Yeah.
time, I see HSPs equating overfunctioning with being a good parent.
Hmm.
And if they function less than their absolute maximum 100% plus, then they feel like they're failing. So, a lot of it is that like mindset around um, understanding when you're being perfectionistic, or when you're setting the bar really high, or yeah, getting stuck in over functioning, just naming it for what it is. I'm doing too much.
Yeah.
I almost never hear HSPs say that, at least when I first get to know them. They usually think they're not doing enough.
Yes.
Or like I'm just scraping by. But being like, wow, to get to the place where you're saying, you know what, I really am over functioning and I deserve to slow down and rest. I just talked to a client about that a week or two ago, and she was like, huh. It was just like it was a novel concept. It was like
Yeah.
this idea of so so should I actually talk to myself that? Should I actually tell myself that I'm doing too much and I deserve to slow down? And I was like, I would, yeah, like practice saying that to yourself because probably what's going on mentally is I'm not doing enough, I'm falling short, I
Right.
need to do more. I'm not a good enough mom in this area. I'm not a good enough parent over here. So at least half the battle to me is recognizing when you are overfunctioning and naming it for what it is, and then committing to making changes. Um, and not feeling guilty about it. So that's like, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's a tall order, but that
Sure.
really is you have to do that. I would say it's ideal to do that first and then make changes from there if you can.
Yeah, at least starting to recognize, because I think we're so used to pushing ourselves as HSPs because we're often told you're not doing enough or you're too sensitive, you're lazy, all of
Mhm.
those negative messages that come in. So we can get stuck in I just need to push all the time. And
Mhm.
parenting, as you mentioned, it's a marathon.
Yeah.
It's 24/7, and even if you're not with your kids 24/7, you're still parent. And I imagine still thinking about that role and thinking about your kids. So we need to just recognize I'm doing too much. This isn't sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is about sustainability and Um, one more thing to mention here is this idea of centering our own needs. So many parents see that as selfish. So many people see that as
Mm.
selfish. I think
Hmm.
especially HSPs, where we're like, oh, if I prioritize, isn't that wrong if I prioritize myself? I do think especially women, a lot of us were socialized that way, unfortunately, that centering our own needs is selfish and that we exist to kind of serve other people. And so I hear that a lot too of, oh, it's selfish for me to take time for myself. I shouldn't do that. So, talking to a therapist or being a part of a group where you can learn to kind of dismantle that and say, I deserve to have some boundaries. I deserve to take care of myself. And not only, ideally, it is coming from a place of love for yourself. Like I always want people to get to that place of I'm going to take myself, give myself a day off or 30 minutes to just reset because I care about myself, my well-being, and I deserve to take that. Um, but if that's not accessible, which sometimes it's not, then at least acknowledging if I don't do that, it's not a great impact on the family or the loved ones, or especially on kids. If we are dysregulated, if we don't get that downtime, if we're not caring for ourselves, if we're overfunctioning, um, like you mentioned, April, like we do, yeah, we burn out. We hit a limit, and often that shows up as for everybody as irritability, as shutting down. I have worked with a lot of HSP parents who for whom it shows up as not just irritability but rage, which can be
Hmm.
very shocking and distressing because they're like, I'm a peaceful person. Where's this coming
Right.
from? I don't want to be this type of a parent.
Yeah.
And often it's coming from a place of overstimulation, of nervous system over arousal, of not taking that time to pause and under function almost. So that's another kind of quip that I use sometimes is can you like be a bad, I mean, not a bad parent necessarily, but like, can you be a bad employee today? Can you be like a
Yeah.
mediocre parent today? What would it be like for you to function at a not overfunction? And maybe
Hmm.
sometimes we need to aim to underfunction a little bit in order to hit that balance, right? But it's just kind of it's an interesting mental exercise to see what would
Hmm.
it be like to do that and how might it feel? We don't need to stay in that, but just to try it out and to see how much maybe we are over functioning and over processing.
Yeah, right. Step back and look at how are you showing up. And I see that happen with a lot of clients who've become parents that they experience a level of anger, rage that they've never experienced before. It's like, well, you've never been probably this overstimulated for this amount of time and this sleep deprived.
Yeah.
Your nervous system is yelling at you, needs something to be different.
Hmm.
And so usually, I mean, that's a clear sign to then, okay, let's reevaluate. How can I dial it down? How can I ask for support? What resources can I tap into?
Mhm.
Um, but it can be scary.
Yeah, it really can
Yeah.
be scary. And, obviously, if it reaches a point where you're having trouble keeping yourself safe or keeping yourself regulated, please get help. So
Hmm.
there's therapists, there's postpartum help, postpartum support international is an amazing nationwide resource. And they have a helpline. Maybe you can link that in the show
I
notes,
definitely
April.
will. I'm writing it down.
Yeah, yeah. So they have free online support groups for parents. They're an amazing resource for parents. Um, and they can help if you feel like I'm not okay, but I don't know what's wrong or I don't know how to get help. Please call their helpline. They're
Hmm.
fantastic. But a lot of the time, that rage or that anger, we might think, oh my gosh, I'm the worst parent in the world. Am I abusive? Am I gonna, I hear a lot like, am I gonna put my child in therapy in the future for what I'm doing
Yeah.
to them? And thankfully, like 99% percent of the time or more, it's nothing like that. It's
Yeah.
just you've had a long day. You don't
Yeah.
haven't gotten enough breaks. um, you see that there's an issue, you can write it with your child. Please notice all the great things that you're doing as a parent as well. But a lot of the times they just need more support, more downtime, more
Yep.
tools and skills to self-regulate, and all of those things are accessible again with help and with support. And there is help and support out there.
Yeah, thank you for outlining so many options, different, levels that people can tap into. So I think we forget what's already accessible.
Hmm.
And that a little bit can go a long way, especially as an HSP, and that you're allowed to be a human as a parent,
Yeah,
and you're allowed to be imperfect. You're still a good enough parent.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you for that. If you could leave us with one message, anything that you would want highly sensitive parents to know, what would that be?
Mm. It's hard to narrow it down. I I think I have two messages, if that's okay.
Please.
Two minute mini messages. Okay, the first it goes off of what you just said, April, which is that you're a person. You are your own person. So
Yeah.
yes, for many people, parenthood and being a parent it's a sacred duty. It's something that we lean heavily into, and that brings us a lot of joy, but also a lot of a lot of overwhelm and a lot of intensity as well. And so my first message is find ways to honor who you are outside
Mm.
of parenthood, and that could look like taking a ceramics class. It could look like um, going go getting your yoga teacher training. It could look like working outside the home at a job that you enjoy and hopefully it doesn't burn you out.
Mhm.
But finding ways to consistently practice. I know it's difficult. I have been there with especially with little ones, but to consistently practice um, a hobby or something that or a spiritual practice or whatever reconnects you to yourself and to your creativity and to those aspects of who you are that ideally doesn't have a lot to do or has nothing to do with being a parent. So that's
Mhm.
number one. A lot of people don't do that or they think it's selfish or superfluous, and I just can't even tell you how healing it can be to do that.
Mhm.
Number two would be uh, kind of similar but broader self-compassion and support. I know I've tooted the horn for that a lot. But like I mentioned, almost every HSP parent that I've met thinks that they should be able to do things on their own, even if cognitively they kind of can recognize that doesn't seem fair, but that's where they're operating from, is this deep core belief that I should be able to do all these things with minimal support or with no support. Um, but just know that you are likely a much better parent than you think you are. You're probably setting the bar too high for yourself, and you're probably taking in some information about parenthood that you might not need to take in.
Mhm.
Not saying not to listen to any advice, but to just consider like I mentioned earlier, ways to dial into your own needs and your own intuition as a parent and kind of be able to tune out some of the noise of the parenting world and just take in a little bit from people that you know and trust and leave the rest behind and just trust yourself.
Yeah, I love that. Just coming back to yourself and clearing out the noise. I can imagine as a parent, there's so much coming at you all the time.
Yeah.
All the different theories and practices and expectations. Like, okay, let's just set that down for a minute. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for those
Totally.
reminders. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and often it's coming from these HSP parents who are so committed and they're so
Yeah.
values based on I just want to be an amazing parent. I want to give my kids this type of childhood. So it's coming from this beautiful place and
Hmm.
but it takes over. It can take over and be too much. So
Yeah. Yeah. And it's okay to slow down.
yeah.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for all that you shared today. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this topic. I know it's one a lot of people are going to need to hear.
Mm,
And I'll be sure to share the resources that you mentioned in the show notes, along with your website, your Instagram, and then you have generously offered 25% off for listeners for your coaching packages and your courses. Can
yes.
you tell folks a little bit more about those offerings?
Yeah, yeah. So this is born out of hopefully what is a parent, which is my passion for supporting highly sensitive parents like myself. So I have two courses available on my website. One is the sort of flagship, the highly sensitive parenthood course, and that is focused on the personal well-being of highly sensitive parents. So it's for parents who are highly sensitive and they are struggling, they're overstimulated. That one, I'm so proud of it. It has meditations and coping tools that go along with each module.
Mm,
And so there's lots of sort of built-in learning opportunities and resources that you can return to. So that's that. And then I have the supporting your highly sensitive child course, which
mm, mhm.
was born from basically requests from people like I liked your course, but I also have an HSP kid and I don't know what I'm doing. So both for HSP parents and non-HSP parents who are raising highly sensitive kids, that's the course for them. And then I have a variety of coaching packages that are just 60-minute one-on-one sessions with me that
Perfect.
can sometimes include the course and sometimes include multiple sessions. So you can find those all linked on my website.
Beautiful. It's so great that you have those one-to-one resources, but also things that people can take on their own time and tap into the coping tools that you talked about. Yeah, that's exciting. Thank you for
Yeah,
that.
thank you.
Yeah, we'll have to have a second conversation around supporting your HSP kids. That we weren't able to get to that today, but I
Yeah,
would
I'd
love
love
to have you
to.
back on for that.
Absolutely. I'll be there. Yeah.